Hello, I am Jonah MacTavish-Slaton, and welcome to my podcast. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that many of you have asked me about over the years, whether it's been on social media or in person. A lot of you have posed a question, and today I hope I can answer that question as best as I can. And that question has always been, what's the best country that you've ever traveled to? And I've traveled to a few countries around the world. And before we proceed with that, I want to point out that I really don't like that question because the best is kind of, to me, not appropriate for how I look at judging countries or rating countries. And because every country has something unique and something really amazing about it. So instead of answering what's the best country that you've ever visited, or what's the most beautiful country you have ever visited, because that can be subjective, I'm going to answer this question to those questions, and that is, what is my favorite country that I've ever visited? And so as we dive into that, I'm going to give a couple of parameters on what makes these countries my favorite countries. Once again, it's subjected to my likes and is also subjected to my preferences and my own personal bias. So some of those things that go into how I would rank these countries that are my most favorite are by this list. One of them is absolutely the landscape. What does the terrain look like? What does the villages look like? Are there mountains? Are there coastlines? Are there deserts? What is the landscape? And with that landscape also is, like I said, villages and cities and the architectural and the design of the country. So I think that's really huge when you're visiting a country because people are very visual. Number two, in my opinion, on visiting a country and what makes it my favorite is the culture. And when I say culture, I'm going to make this really broad, okay? So number one is landscapes, the terrain. Number two is the culture of the country. And by culture, I mean what are the traditions and what is the history and what is the art, what's the cuisine, what's the food and drink like, and what are some of the traditions and languages and what makes up their society. So that would, to me, be number two. Number one is landscape. Number two is culture. Number three would be the actual people themselves. So how friendly are they? How do they interact? And what are their values as far as normal everyday life and society? And with that, I can throw in maybe the language barrier, and how well they can, I get along in that country and how well I can learn some of the basic phrases to get by, and then their understanding of English. That's not important. That's not what I rank in on, but I do that. I rank it, by people. So landscape, culture, people. And fourth would probably be accessibility. So how easy is it to get around? How easy is it to rent a car? What are the roads like? What are the signs like? And will any of that take away from the experience if I'm on a holiday there or on vacation when I'm visiting it? What will it do to the experience? Will it take away? Will it be a hindrance? Or will it be actually something that makes it easier and makes it more engaging? And then finally, and this is the deal breaker for a lot of people traveling abroad, this is affordability and cost. And so that could make a big decision because some people can go to these countries, but they're so wrapped up on how expensive the food was. If they rented a car, how expensive gas or petrol was in that country, the accommodations, maybe even going to museums, just the astronomical cost versus other countries. Some like to go to places like Ecuador where everything is super cheap and they fall in love with it and it becomes one of their favorite countries versus going to a place like Iceland or Switzerland, where the prices are astronomical for certain things that here in the States may be a little cheaper, or like the Central American countries are cheaper. So those are the parameters. Those are the five. So as I dive into my favorite countries that I've ever visited, that's the list of parameters, my own personal algorithm on what makes these countries my favorite countries. So it's hard to say the order, but we're going to go with five countries. And I'm going to give away a little secret. It's actually going to be six, because one of these countries are very similar to the other country to me, and why I think it's a brilliant place to visit, but it's a really biased. And people that know me will know why I've really combined these two. I'm still going to call it my top five favorite country list, but there will be six. So that's a little disclaimer there. So I hate going in order. I really hate going in order on number one, number two, and so forth. So I'm not going to do that. So I'll disappoint you if you want me to rank my top five countries. I'm not going to do it, but I will discuss five in no particular order. So to start it off, the first country that I'm going to mention as my favorite country of all the countries around the world that I visited is Norway. And people that have talked to me off camera or in person or even on social media knows that I am a huge fan of Norway. And I'm a very huge fan of visual aspects and terrain of a country. And so it has a very diverse landscape, but it doesn't have desert and it doesn't have tropical beaches and such like that. But what it makes up for is the fjords, and the mountains are just incredibly amazing. Okay, so right off the bat, it won me over with the landscape portion. And number two about Norway that makes me one of my favorite countries is the fact that it is very easy to get along with the Norwegian people. They're very friendly, they're very laid back, and they're just genuine people. And a plus to this, if you're an English speaker as your native language, these guys speak perfect English. I mean, they're fluent. And that makes, going and traveling and visit different locations and attractions, really, the ease of that is really amazing. So that's a big, big plus. Another plus is their signs. A lot of their signs are in English and in Norwegian, and you're finding that really all over the world. But the thing is, with these signs, it's very simplified, especially the road signs. So everywhere I go in the world, I always rent a car. I get a car for hire, and we set out on a road trip practically. And the roads are amazingly easy to follow. Even without my GPS, I probably would have been fine with a map and in the road signs. What also leads me to another point is that their roads are amazingly good condition. I don't maybe up in the north toward Antarctica. I'm sorry, not Antarctica. Toward the Arctic Circle, maybe there's roads up there that are not so good. But from middle and western and southern Norway, the roads were incredibly good. And you'll see on one of my other countries as a kind of a con to that country will be the roads. But right now we're talking about Norway, and the roads are really, really good. And so it goes from the ease of usage, the designs of the roads. There's no complications in Norway. It is straightforward. It reminds me of being in Texas, outside of like Dallas or Houston, but in simple, smaller towns here in Texas, where the roads are just laid out very simple, very easy to use. Those are all great pluses. With the people being very laid back, I'm going to harp on the roads here. So going back to the roads, not only are they beautifully maintained roads, you're not going to find a pothole in Norway, and the signs are unbelievable. The other thing is that the drivers are so friendly on the roads. You won't get any of this crazy, chaotic driving there in Norway, especially once you get out of the bigger cities like Oslo. The driving is very laid back, and the people there, they're not really in a big rush, and they'll kind of pull over and let you go by, and no one's riding your bumper unless they're probably a tourist with a rental car. But that's amazing. It made the whole experience for Norway unbelievably relaxed and enjoyable. So the next thing I loved about Norway is it's a very clean country. When I say clean, you won't find very much litter anywhere. It's immaculate. You drive down the roads and you look around, like you can go an hour in any direction from here in Texas, and you're going to see probably an old tire on the road or a piece of rubber or a pallet or a box or a Coke can. You won't get that in Norway. I mean, it is beautiful. If you go by houses, they're all, I'm not going to say they're like manicured, like they're living in some kind of little plastic bubble, like a Legoland house. Not what I mean. What I mean is everything is really nice, very clean, very simple, and you don't have this, and sorry, my Arkansas cousins, you don't have this Arkansas yard full of all these junk cars and stuff that people in the rural areas are never going to even use, and all this. You don't have that, okay? It's great. It's amazing. It's very easy and enjoyable on the eyes. So as you can tell, Norway holds a high place in my heart for one of my favorite spots in the world that I've ever visited. It's an amazing place. And I think I'm going to end on this as far as all the things that I like. I talked about the scenery, I talked about the people, I talked about the ease of traveling, I talked about how clean and organized the country is and how fluent the people are. And I'm going to end on this is that I love Norwegian and Norse culture. So, and that's a little bit of bias in me because my family comes from Scandinavia thousands of years ago before we entered the British Isles and Ireland and on to America. So that was something that very interested me about Scandinavia. And I've always been a big fan of the Norse, not just the Viking stuff that you see on TV or you read about on the internet. I'm talking about the Norse, even pre-Viking, back into the Nordic Bronze Age. I really get nerded out about that stuff. So the culture and the history, very, very important and makes it one of my top spots that I've ever visited. And so if there's going to be a con with Norway, is one thing, and that's probably the cost of two things. Because the attractions were about average cost. They weren't all that expensive to other countries I've visited in Europe. And the accommodations were reasonable. I thought, when you talk about the big three in Europe that's really, really expensive, and we're talking about Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, very expensive accommodations. When I did a little research, I found out that I could get places in Norway cheaper than I could here in the States that were, far superior for the price. So what I'm going to say about cost has nothing to do with attractions. The rental car was actually reasonably priced, and the accommodations were. So my little nitpick would be probably the cost of food, your average food. If you go out to eat, it's very, very expensive there. And probably the number one thing would be the cost of petrol. Gas is very expensive there, and I believe the only other country in the world where gas may be more expensive than in Norway will probably be Iceland, if my memory serves me correct. So this is a little tiny thing. Now, I drive a lot when I'm in countries, and I explore. I mean, it is one giant road trip and adventure. So that was one thing that was very, that stood out in my mind, is that I did spend quite the penny on gas. Other than that, easily makes my top 5. And until I visit another country, maybe to knock it out of the list, I don't know if it's possible. Just because the connection I had in Norway, it is a highly recommended country if you do it right. It can be a very exhausting attempt to explore a lot of Norway because it's a very long country, north to south. So you have to plan your route out. And I always say plan it in a circular motion, or fly in one city, fly out the other. And that's the best way to do road trips. So that's Norway, part of my top 5. Moving on. Next on the list, not in any order, but next is Ecuador. And I wanted to do Ecuador next because it's going to fall in line with Norway. Because when we talk about cost, it's on the opposite end of the spectrum. When we talk about ease of roads and quality of roads, on the opposite end of the spectrum. And there's pros and cons in both of those for Ecuador. So number 2 on the list, but not in order, is Ecuador. Man, I've been wanting to go to Ecuador for a long time. And everything that I've researched and all the pictures has just made me want to get on that plane and fly down to South America to visit this country. And luckily for me, the COVID restrictions started lifting, and was able to get on a plane and fly down to Ecuador back in 2021. And man, I'm so glad. I don't know why it took me so long to get there. I had planned on going to Ecuador several times in the past, but things, got in the way. Maybe it was work, maybe it was family, what have you. So it was always put off in the back burner. But I am so glad that I got down to Ecuador and visited this South American country. Now, I will start off with, like I did with Norway, is what attracts me to countries and puts them in my favorite list has always been landscapes and terrain. I can go to a country, say like the Netherlands, where really landscape and terrain plays a zero factor if it would have been my favorite location. But people, culture, and other things could push it up, but it's very hard. A country like that. And no disrespect to the people in the Netherlands, it's just, to me, there are no visual aspects outside of maybe some of the architectural and historical concepts. But as far as like nature, which I love, and that's why I fell in love with Norway. But Ecuador is right there with Norway. Now, the difference between Ecuador and Norway is Ecuador is far more diverse. You have the tropical beaches, beautiful tropical beaches on the Pacific side. And then you have the infamous longest mountain chain in the world, the Andes Mountains. So you have Chilabamba, Cotopaxi, these volcanoes along the Pan American Highway. Amazing, amazing. And then you have the Amazon rainforest that is a tremendous place to visit. And then you can go south to get this jungle mountainy scene. It's almost like you're going into a place like Cambodia or Vietnam. So if you could see just this explosive, diverse country, and it's the most diverse country that I've ever visited when you talk about landscape, completely amazing. So that easily makes it in my top 5. And to put it in perspective too is then you have these llama type animals. The names, I'll probably remember after this video, but you have llamas and these other pack animals that are up in the Andes, and it's just like something out of a documentary. It's like walking into National Geographic. And I didn't even go to the big attraction in Ecuador now. We flew into Quito and in the north and drove all the way through the Amazon forest, down the Pan American Highway, visited the Andes and the Great Mountains. Took probably the best horse ride that I've ever taken in my life. Trekking through the Andes Mountains, beautiful. Some of y'all probably saw pictures on my social media, but by far I've taken horse rides, quite a different places, and man, it was amazing and affordable. We'll get to that in a little bit as far as the cost. But just going back to the country itself, I saw so much of it. The Amazon rainforest, went to Banos and went to the falls, the Devers, Cauldron Falls, went to Cuenca, and it's just the diversity of that country just blows me away, of the desert, the jungle mountains, the Amazon, the Andes mountains, and then on top of all that, you have historical cities that are some of the oldest cities in the Americas. These are Spanish colonial cities, such as Cuenca and such as Quito. And I'm like I said, I'm a very big history nerd, and man, the architecture and some of the cathedrals and government buildings that was built back in the 1600s, amazing. So you get not only do you get this diverse culture, diverse landscape and terrain, you get a lot of history. And to top it off, one of the greatest Inca sites in all of South America is Inca Parunca. And it is probably the most well-preserved observatory found right there on that spot. So it's endless capabilities of exploring Ecuador. So that's it in a nutshell. But one thing I did learn is, I flew into Quito and then flew out on a city down along the Pacific side of the country. So went north to south, zigzagging around. Beautiful country, a lot of diversity. Number two is the people. Now, a lot of people say that Ecuador can be a little sketchy, but you can go downtown Texarkana or in some spots in our small city, and it could be sketchy, especially for outsiders. So I didn't see any dangers of that. But once again, I'm a smart traveler and I'm a aware tourist, so I'm not going to put myself in that situation. And so what I've already researched and I knew certain areas that they target tourists, pickpockets and stuff like that. So obviously, being aware of your situation and knowing some of the routes to go paid off. And then also don't be out at night in certain areas. And that's here in the States. That's here in Texas. No brainer. But I felt just as safe in Ecuador as any place I've ever been on earth. Okay. And that's the truth. Even when I was in Quito, where you hear these stories about, people getting pickpocketed or get their cameras or their phones stolen, I felt safe. I was aware of my surroundings and was tuned into my situation, but it was nothing. And I know things happen, but don't make yourself an easy target. And I've did a podcast in the past about don't make yourself an easy target, especially in countries or cities and countries that put you at particular risk. But going back to Ecuador, I know there's some political things going on and off the last few years. And that's, largely in the bigger cities. Out in the countryside, I've never felt more relaxed, never felt more safe. And so the people there were lovely. Now, there's a difference between Norway and Ecuador and the language. So you will find plenty of people that know how to speak English. And usually people in America, if you're visiting and you're American, you usually have a good working knowledge of Spanish. So you can get along fine. But don't expect very many fluent people that speak English. They're there and you'll run into them. But don't expect a lot of them, even in attractions and shops, to be able to speak very good English. Nothing like Norway where just about everyone spoke it fluently. But the people there were very lovely. I found them very genuine and very helpful, and you hear these stories about them wanting to sell you stuff and kind of coming up to you and not wanting to leave you alone. I didn't experience that. I mean, I went to several tourist areas. I went to several markets, and I actually bartered with them, and I didn't want to rip them off. I know a lot of people go, it costs you $10 and it says $10 on the tag and you can get it for $5 if you keep hammering them. Well, I'm a guy that likes to barter. So sure, I'm going to do a little bartering with the people like I do everywhere. But, I would give them $8 instead of 10, even though they probably would have taken 6. But they were really relaxed, nothing pushy, not from what I seen. Maybe others that went to Ecuador has a different experience, but not me. So terrain, landscape, diversity, just amazing. The people, very, very genuine. Okay, loved it. Some of the best things I've ever done around the world was in Ecuador. So I just love the country. Okay. And probably one of the most important things that people go to Ecuador and love, besides the diversity of the landscape, is the affordability. I don't know if I've ever been to a country, even Mexico, even some parts to Mexico where things are cheap. I don't think I've ever been to a country that was as affordable as Ecuador. It blew me away. The rental car was cheaper than anywhere else I've been, but I've been to other places where it wasn't that much cheaper. And let's face it, the rental car companies are an international corporation. So, but when it comes to accommodations, it was a crazy, crazy cheap. You could go to Ecuador and spend about $30-$40 a night on accommodation and lodging and stay in pretty nice places. And that's super affordable when you look at, going to Iceland or going to Switzerland, where anything, you can't get anything really under about $150 a night. That's nice. There, I'm talking about 25, 30, 40 bucks a night. You're getting really, really nice things. Sure, in Cuenca or Quito, you could pay a couple of $100 a night if you want these big, expensive name brand hotels, but you can get something nice, clean, very enjoyable accommodations for, like I said, roughly around, I think when I went, we paid about roughly about $40 a night. The only reason it was even that high, I think it came out to $48. But the only reason why it was that high is because I stayed at a place at Cotopaxi in this ranchero villa. Beautiful, but I splurged a little bit. I didn't have to stay there. And then I wanted to stay up on a mountain in front of a volcano in Baños. And it wasn't that much expensive, but instead of staying in the town for about $30 a night in the village, I went up on top of the mountain on the other side of the volcano because I wanted to film and take pictures of the volcano and the city below. And so I think I ended up paying like $80 a night, but it was well worth it. I would have paid $200 a night, to be honest. So the affordability with the lodging is crazy, crazy cheap. The gas is also pretty cheap. I would say it was probably comparable to Texas. And you say, well, how's that cheap? Well, if you go to Europe and compare Europe's gas prices to prices of gas in Texas or in the South here in the States, you will understand when I say it's the price is very much the same or equitable or similar there in Ecuador. You will understand that that's actually pretty cheap gas. So that was a plus. The affordability is a plus. And the other thing is the attractions are very, very cheap. And if you want to buy souvenirs and namesakes or anything like that, pick up something for family or friends back home, they're really, really reasonable price. Yes, you do have in the high tourist areas where they have the more expensive items and souvenirs, but you can get them reasonably priced and far cheaper than anywhere in Europe. And it leads me to my last part of the accommodation. My last part of the cost, which makes it really a place that puts it on my top list because accommodations are cheap, gas is reasonable, souvenirs and things like that are very cheap. Even the attractions are very affordable. It leads me to the last thing is food. Okay, the food's really super cheap. Now, I wouldn't put Ecuadorian food on a high list of food cuisine around the world. I mean, it's not like the food that you might find in France or Italy or Spain or something like that. But it's good food and it is very, very cheap. I mean, you could go and have breakfast for like $2. You can have supper, drink all for around $4 or $5 and go to Europe and try to do that. Even here in the States, it is impossible. So that makes Ecuador a very, very attractive place for me to visit. So that's Ecuador. Beautiful, beautiful. And talking about eating cheap, I actually ate a guinea pig there. I had to try it. I think they call it cuy or something, cuy. And it was, tastes kind of like probably similar to chicken, everything tastes like chicken, but it was more almost like alligator. It kind of had that tang to it. So moving along, that was Ecuador, and that's all the pros. Now here's, if you want to have some negatives, which there's not a lot, obviously it may not be as safe as other countries. Now, personally, that wasn't a negative for me. But if you want to talk about a couple of cons for Ecuador, I would say this is that the language barrier is probably the largest language barrier that I've ever been anywhere. Luckily, I met a few people along the way that were native to Ecuador, Ecuadorians that could speak very good English. But for the most part, if you're on the street asking for directions, they're clueless. They're not like Parisians. I've been in Paris, and the French will just completely ignore you or look at you like you're stupid and won't even respond. These guys will try to respond, but they don't have the ability to communicate with you or with me in my broken English. Not a deal breaker at all, but that is probably one of the cons. And then the other thing is, and this is why I wanted to compare it to Norway, is their roads are kind of horrendous once you get out of the highway system. The Pan American Highway is a pretty well developed road that goes from to the north in Quito down through Cotopaxi, down through Rio Chimborazo, and I believe it ends up going through Cuenca. That's a very well developed road, and some of the highways offshoot in that road are fairly decent. But if you get off in the back, what we would call here in the States, like county roads or farm roads, you're going to be in for a treat. And I now know why they say, if you're going to get a car for hire, get a four-wheel drive, something off the road, which I did. And that's one of the bad experiences. If I did have a bad experience, it was the first day arriving at the airport in Quito. Is I was supposed to have a four-wheel drive SUV and ended up having a little car that I did not think was going to make it even to the first stop. Surprisingly, we put several thousand miles on this car going up and down mountains through villages and through the jungles, and it held up. I don't know how. But going back to the roads, they could be pretty bad. And I remember one time we were driving from Cotopaxi and I believe to the Amazon, and the road was barely wide enough for two vehicles to go by. And if it was a truck, we were in a small car, so if it was an oncoming truck, they would have to get over into the ditch a little bit. Two small cars could barely pass. And you would come across potholes. I've never seen potholes this large in a road in my life. Over half of the road would be a humongous, and I'm talking about like a 8-foot pothole that was probably about 4 or 5 feet deep. I probably could have stood in it and it would be up to my neck. And imagine running a little car, which was maybe about, maybe a foot off the ground, 10 inches off the ground, running into one of those. It would have been a complete disaster. So that would be one of the things I would call out. It wasn't a deal breaker to the country. It still makes my top 5. But that was disappointing. So don't trust the rental car companies. And I'm going to tell you, that's like that a lot around the world, especially in South America, Central America. So the roads, they're when you get off the beaten track, you could be in trouble. So just prepare yourself for that. And lastly, as comparing this to the other guys on the top 5 list, it wasn't a very clean country in a lot of places. So there's a lot of litter on the roads. It's a lot of rundown places. This is a third world country, and that it's very noticeable when you're driving around. Large amounts of the population live in almost shack dwellings. So it's a very poor country. And so that would be one of the things that is not as appeasing as really that perfect landscape in Norway, as far as like homes being very clean, very organized. Don't expect to find a lot of that, especially in the rural areas of Ecuador. Very poor, and a lot of litter, trash, and just different things along the roads and out in fields and so forth. So and the last thing I'm going to say about Ecuador, which is really going back to the affordability, which makes it really, really nice, but it has a con, is that they use the American dollar. So all of their change and all of their bills, everything is in the American dollar. And the exchange rate, there's none because you're using the American dollar. But that American dollar, like I said, goes a long way versus here in the States. So that's a cool thing, is because you roll around and when you arrive in the country, you don't have to worry about exchanging your currency for the local currency. It's right there in your pocket. But I collect currency from around the world. And so that was kind of disappointing that I didn't be able to get currency. So I actually found someone and asked around, and they were able to give me a couple Ecuadorian bills for my collection. But, I didn't get them like I normally do by just exchanging it and using the money. But that is a cool aspect, is that you don't have to worry about exchanging your money when you get there or on the flight back home. So Ecuador is one of my top 5. Rolling on, and this will be very, very biased, by the way, is this next country. And I think people are by now going, hey, you've mentioned Norway, you've mentioned Ecuador. What? You haven't mentioned this one country? Well, here it comes, because I know you've been waiting for it. I'm going to mention the country that's in my top 5 that everyone that knows me knows is going to be in my top 5. But when I told you that this was top 5 with a disclaimer. It was actually 6 countries as my top 5. And I know the people in those countries probably are not going to like this so much, but if they know their heritage and they know their history, they'll understand why I are including them into one spot. And here we go. Hands down, one of my favorite countries that I've ever visited, and I have visited this country a lot, practically second home, is Ireland. Ta-da! That didn't shock anybody that knows me, right? I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Ireland. Ireland is a fairly known country, unlike Norway and unlike Ecuador, that doesn't get near the amount of American visitors. And I'm sure probably 99% of the people watching me right now have never been to Norway or never been to Ecuador. So majority of you haven't, but a lot of you have been to Ireland. Probably a quarter of my friends list have been to Ireland. Probably another quarter of my friends list are probably from Ireland or the British Isles. So Ireland's a no-brainer. I love the people in Ireland. I love the Irish language, Gaelic. I love Gaelic. I can speak a small smidge of it. And I love everything about it. I don't like the currency exchange rate. That's one con I don't like, because I wish they would go back to the Irish punt, because I don't really like euros. It's just too bland. You know, all these countries using euros. But I do love the country. It's a very diverse country as far as, you know, the mountains and the rolling meadows and the castles and the history. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Ireland. I've talked about enough Ireland in the past that if you listen to my other podcasts or videos, you know that Ireland is very dear to me. You know, my family migrated from Ireland to America. Probably over half of my ancestors came from Ireland. And so the landscape, man, it's beautiful, and people that live there know that. I've been to every county in Ireland. There's 32 counties in Ireland. I've been to every single county, and probably half of people that live in Ireland, the native Irelanders, have never even seen all 32 counties. But, you know, I'm a very big history nerd, and I love exploring where my ancestors came from. So obviously I spent a lot of time. And to point out that I've been to Ireland so much that my country list around the world has not been near as big as it could have been if I would have made trips outside of Ireland rather than using that one trip overseas at one going to particularly one country all those years. But I do love Ireland, and it makes my top 5 easy. The landscape and the terrain, there's so much diversity, the culture, the history, the language, which is all part of my heritage. And, you know, the Guinness, you can't get a good dark stout here in the States that tastes like Guinness or Murphy's or Bemis or any of the other ones over there. You have to go there and go to a pub and drink it straight from the tap. That is where you get the absolute best Guinness in the world. And, you know, when you talk about my favorite drinks, hands down, when we talk about beer, is I'm a big stout guy, and I love Guinness and any of those type of stouts. And I'm also a big German beer guy. I love the dark beers, the dark lagers, and the dunkels. But so that makes Ireland, with the history and all the context about that, in my top 5 easily. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to piggyback in the same spot with Ireland, and I'm going to sneak in a 6th country in my top 5, and that would be Scotland. Now, as I said, a lot of you that are my friend list, a lot of you people you watch, and you've taken trips to Ireland if you're not already from Ireland, and you know that it's a great place, and you know the love I have for it because of my family and the language and the culture and the history. Scotland so much, probably not as many of you has visited Scotland. But Scotland, to me, is right up there with Ireland. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of my family that ended up in Ireland came from Scotland as well. And so a lot of ancestors from Scotland. I love Scottish Gaelic, the Scottish version of the Gaelic language. I love the history of Scotland. You know that I have a lot of historical connections through my ancestry to Scotland. It's a beautiful place. It has a lot of diverse landscapes. When you're talking about Orkney or the Hebrides or the Isle of Skye, just an incredible country, and the people, especially in the rural areas. What I love about Ireland in the rural areas, these guys will talk your ear off. And I love it because I love to talk, and I love to talk about culture and history and all those types of subjects. So those 2 countries where I have recent family that migrated to America from, I love it. I love it. I love it. So no brainers. Those 2 countries, Ireland and Scotland, are going to make my list. If I had one drawback to those countries, I would say that it would maybe the cost. It is a little bit more expensive for things versus other European countries, such as like Portugal or Spain, or even, countries in Central or South America. But, no big deal. You don't go over there fussing about the price of petrol, okay? You go over there to enjoy your Guinness in the pub, or your great, whiskey up in the Scottish Highlands, listening to the old timers in the rural areas tell you about how it was, and how they tell you about your family that they're also kin to. So you're running into, literally, I can't tell you how many times I've ran into fourth and fifth cousins. And it's silly because that's pretty far back, but I mean, I constantly run into them when we go, oh yeah, that's my great grandfather. Yeah, that's my great grandmother. And they go back home. I go back home to the States, and all something we match up and go, wow, we do share the same great grandfather, 4 generations back, just out of nowhere, just a stranger. So I love those things. Those intimate meetings with people are brilliant. So there you have it. Joining in Norway, joining Ecuador is kind of a piggyback situation with Ireland and Scotland as part of my top 5 favorite countries. So now I'm going to move on. And the next country is probably a lot of people's favorite country, and that's going to be Italy. Any surprise there? No. Because Italy is, to me, very much as close to as a country as Ecuador. I told you Ecuador was by far, hands down, the most diverse country that I've ever been to. Now, I live in a very diverse country. I live in the United States. We have mountains here. We have, we have beaches, not tropical beaches here in the 48 states, but we have deserts. The United States is one of the most diverse countries in the world. We do have tropical areas down in Puerto Rico or over in Hawaii, but it's, I don't like to say we're tropical because the continuous part of us is in the 48 states. So Ecuador had the deserts, the rainforests, the snow-capped mountains. It had everything, the coastline, tropical coastline. So Italy makes my top 5 list, and it has a diverse landscape that most people don't think about. Most people think about Italy, they automatically think about the big cities. Okay, they automatically think about Rome, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, all the Roman ruins, and all the aspects of Rome. Or they think of Venice and the canals and the gondolas, or they think of Milan, or they think of Florence. So anytime someone thinks of Italy, they automatically think of these cities. Now, these cities are wonderful, and they're amazing, but that's not why I put Italy in the top 5. To me, you have several different regions, and only Ecuador, in the countries that I've visited outside the United States, have this type of ecological and terrain diversity. And Italy has that. It has that for me because you do have somewhat of a desert condition. Believe it or not, I don't know if it would be classified as desert, but there is certain areas that are very similar to desert regions, especially down in southern Tuscany, and then down toward the south toward Naples. And then you have, this tropical sense around the coastline. If you go to Cinque Terre, beautiful, very beautiful coastlines. The Mediterranean Sea is just amazing. And then you have the mountains. And there's a couple of different mountain regions, actually. You have the mountains in the Piedmont, like north of Turin, close to the border of Switzerland, that are unbelievable. They have their own different look. And I've been to the Alps in Germany and in France and Austria and in Switzerland. And so each of those Alps have a different flavor, a different feel, different culture. But the mountain regions in Italy are really amazing. I went to several different ones. You have the ones that are close to the Swiss border, and then you have the mountains that are north of Trento, toward the Austrian border. Beautiful, beautiful. The Dolomites. If you ever go to Italy, you have to hit the Dolomites. I mean, I would almost go to the Dolomites over visiting Florence or Venice, actually. No lie. That's how incredible they are. Very, very top. And then up at Lake Como and then around that area where you have the mountains and the several lake systems, just beautiful. I love northern Italy as much as probably southern Italy. But you also have the wine grape growing regions. So you have vineyards all over the place. You have the vineyards out in Piedmont, which is in the western and northern part of Italy. Then you have all the vineyards in central Italy, which would be around the the Tuscany area, and then you go north, and I forgot the name of the region, but there's like North Central Italy as just another wine producing region that has beautiful vineyards. So castles everywhere, and I'm a big castle fan. Scotland, Ireland has all those castles, but lots of castles. I really didn't realize the amount of castles that were in Italy. Blew me away. And then the cities. Good Lord. There's probably been no place in the world that I've ever visited without as much history and archaeological substance as you find in Rome. I'm sorry, in Italy. And primarily it's because of the great cultures and civilizations that came out of Italy. Before the Romans, they were already building things and far advanced in their city building. And then Rome came along and the advancement of technology. And then you have the things that led up to the Renaissance with all these great sculptors and painters and that all this great architecture in the cities and in the churches and the cathedrals, just amazing. So when it comes to culture and history and archaeological and architectural designs, you're not going to hardly find any country in the world that can compare to Italy. Once again, that nerdness came out of me, and it's just crazy, crazy good. So we look at the landscapes; they're unbelievably diverse. You look at the wine. I'm a big wine guy. I do love my stouts and my dark lagers and stuff like that as beer, but I'm also a really big fan of wine. And being able to visit several different vineyards and test wine that comes right out of their facility was amazing. So that puts Italy right up there. And Italy is actually, for the most part, not that expensive. The accommodations were shockingly cheap. Probably they weren't Ecuadorian cheap, but when we compare it to places like Switzerland or Norway or Sweden or any of those countries, way more affordable, especially if you do research. Once again, you can spend a fortune staying at high expensive accommodations there in Italy, but there's no need to. And the accommodations we stayed in were authentic. We connected with the owners. It was amazing. And some of my favorite accommodations I've ever stayed in the world are right there in Italy. I know I've talked to y'all a lot about my accommodations in Ireland and Scotland have been amazing. And talking to the owners and the local people in the village, well, Italy's right up there with it. So we got the terrain. We've got the affordability. We have the culture and the history, and then the cuisine. Let me say something. When they say you haven't had pizza until you came to Italy, that is correct. Now, you may not like it as much as your Americans, be honestly. People from New York or Chicago may prefer the more bland American style. But I will say this. The Parmesan, the real Parmesan cheese blocks, and the mozzarella, oh my God. The best mozzarella that I've ever had anywhere. And I've had mozzarella cheeses, that's pretty common all over Europe and here in the States. But the mozzarella cheese in Italy, and I had it probably at 3 or 4 different spots, is the best mozzarella cheese. And it actually, I didn't really know how much I liked mozzarella cheese until I had it in Italy. So, it moved way up to some of my other favorites. And it entered that pantheon of my favorite cheeses. So, getting off on the other foot there, but the cuisine in Italy is very good. And I'm also going to say this, the wine's superb. They had some good beer. Yeah, that's shocking when you have places like Austria, the Czech Republic, Germany, Denmark, even Switzerland that produce really high quality beer, the Dutch in Europe. Italy's beer, I've tried probably 4 or 5 different local beers made and sourced in Italy, was actually pretty good. It's drinkable beer. If I, it wasn't, if I had one, I'll drink it. No, it was really good. It wasn't my type of beer, but for the content, the Italian lager is, in my opinion, far superior to the Michelob or the Coors or Miller or Budweiser here. Far superior. It tasted really like a good craft lager, but smoother. So I was very, very impressed. So as you see, Italy has had some high marks as one of my favorite countries that I've ever been to. Very, very high marks. So is there any cons to Italy? Well, I think that with this con, it's a double-edged sword because you can go to places in Italy and this is not the case. But I think probably the biggest con to go into Italy, or the biggest negative for me, is the crowds. You're going to be overrun with tourists in certain areas, especially at certain times of the year. I will tell you now, we went in the off season or toward the end of the season. It was beginning of the off season, and certain areas were just overran with tourists. And so, and to point things out, in Florence, if you go to see the great cathedral downtown, or you go to the high vantage point across the river looking down into Florence, it's a very big spot for photographers. It's harsh, man. It is terrible, the amount of tourists that are everywhere. If you go some of the wall cities in Tuscany, they're just overran with tourists. Just if you go to Cinque Terre, I mean, luckily for me that it was the off season and most of the people stayed at the first village we got to, because the first village at Cinque Terre was incredibly crowded, and I almost wish I didn't even bother to put that on the agenda because it was overwhelming. And we walked through it, and it was beautiful, but you couldn't really enjoy it because there was so many people, just back and forth. The crowds, every street was jam packed. Not my idea of exploring and having an enjoyable time abroad. Luckily for us, we got on the train because the train runs through the 5 villages. Luckily for us, the next village was high up above the cliffs, and it wasn't down on the shoreline like the other one with a little harbor. And that one, because I guess no one wanted to climb, we literally climbed, I want to say 4,000 steps. It was ridiculous. It was probably 1,500 feet. It was a trek. But the amount of tourists there dropped off by like 95%. And even though we were tired and we didn't know we were going to climb that far up, it was relaxing and enjoyable. The next 2 villages were not crowded at all. They did have some tourists, but it was better. But like I said, if you go into the peak season in Cinque Terre, I would never do that. Never, ever, ever. If I ever would go back to Cinque Terre, which I would, it was lovely, I would probably even go maybe a couple of weeks later than when I went, because I don't like fighting the crowds. And any big tourist attraction in Italy, whether you're in Milan or you're in Venice, Rome, Florence, it's going to be jam packed. So there are clues, though, that you can get around that if you do go in the peak season. There's some things you have to go see. We went to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and it was just beautiful because I said we're going to get there, and we're going to get there before the tourist buses arrive and everybody coming off of the cruise boats. So we got there pretty early. I think it was around 7:30, 7:45. And for the first probably 20, 30 minutes, it was very relaxing. A few tourists. But by the time we were about halfway through, it was overwhelming, the amount of tourists. So you can make plans to go in the off season. You can make plans in certain times of the day to beat that, and that's what I would recommend. But I'm not going to go through all this on this podcast, but there are some cities like Trento that a lot of tourists don't go to, but they have a lot of history. They have castles, they have towers, they have a lot of places that you can visit, and then you have the landscapes and the mountains and even grape regions right outside of that. You know, if I had to spend a week between Florence or Venice versus spending a week in Trento, I'm sorry, I would pick Trento every time. So one of the negatives is with a country that's that diverse, has that much history, and all it is to offer for you to come and do in attractions, you're going to know that it's going to be really heavily crowded and overran with tourists at times. Not a deal breaker. It makes it easily in my top 5. I love Italy. And I was surprised about how much I love Northern Italy. Because I knew, like going to places like Southern Germany and Austria, Switzerland, the French Alps, those places are amazing, but I never really imagined Italy. And I knew the north was mountainous, but I never knew I would fall in love with Northern Italy like I did. I mean, I love the South. I love Tuscany. I love the vineyards. I love the historical walled cities. I love Florence. I love Genoa. I love Turin. I love all that. But I prefer North Central Italy. To me, that was amazing, and I love it. So if there was a drawback to Italy, it would probably be the tourist, just overwhelming. And it does make it tense, and it's not near as relaxing or enjoyable as Norway, but it still makes my top 5 list. And the other thing that I would point out is that compared to Norway, the traffic is no comparison. Norway, laid back, relaxing, very courteous drivers. Italy, none at all, especially when you get into the villages, even small villages, and anywhere near bigger cities. It is total chaos. And you better be a very well-rounded driver. Now, I've driven abroad in many different countries, many different landscapes, so I'm pretty proficient at it. But if you've never driven abroad, or if you've never driven abroad in a place like that, it's going to take some use to getting to, and it is crazy chaotic. I mean, it's just comparison. We were in Switzerland the week before when we came into Italy, and the traffic there in the bigger cities can be a little hairy, but for the most part, it was very smooth, very I wouldn't say laid back, but once you got out of the cities, it was pretty laid back. Italy, not so much. So overly crowded with tourists and very chaotic driving, especially in the big cities, would be the two things that I'd point out about Italy. But loved Italy. It was an amazing place. So Italy makes my top 5 favorite places in the world. Now I'm going to end with my 5th, which is technically, like I disclaimed, my 6th countries in my top 5, and that's Switzerland. And it's kind of weird because Switzerland is very reminiscent of northern Italy. And I'm going to say this. I love southern Germany, the Bavaria area of southern Germany with their beer and castles and mountains. I love it. The problem is I didn't explore enough of Germany to put it in my top 5. I've been to Germany a couple of times, but not extensively like I've done Scotland, Ireland, and Norway, Ecuador, Switzerland, Italy. I mean, I didn't spend but only a couple of days in Germany. So I really love Germany, but I can't put it up there in my top 5. Same thing with Austria. I've spent, 4 days in Austria. Beautiful. And Austria really reminds me a lot in a way of Switzerland. But I can't put it in there with Switzerland because, once again, I spent way more time in Switzerland on my travels. So let's get to Switzerland. And let me tell you right now, the Swiss mountains, man, they are amazing. The hiking is superb. And what I love about their hiking is you can get to most places without killing yourself physically and taking up entire days to try to find these vocal points to have some amazing scenery. And I love that. I appreciate how well manicured Switzerland is with their hiking trails and with their viewpoints. And what I like about Switzerland, it gives me a nice flavor. It has a very distinct culture, great cheese, even some really great beer, which shocked me, especially after being in places like Austria and Germany and drinking, German and Austrian beers, Czech beers. I was very surprised. There was a few beers that I really liked in Switzerland. But Switzerland is a beautiful, beautiful place. I love Switzerland. Highly recommend it. And it is very easy to get to in and out of places, and it's a small country, so you can really see a vast amount of Switzerland in a short time period. And I do love the rural part of Switzerland. It's very amazing. The people are really friendly, and once again, it's just a well laid out country. It's very accessible, and there's not a lot of complications when it comes to Switzerland. And there's 2 regions, one of my favorite wine regions in the world. Now, get this, I've been to some really incredible wine regions around the world, and you really can't top the French wine regions or the Italian wine regions, but I'm going to say this right here on record. My favorite wine region that I've ever visited, it's not in Napa or Sonoma out in California, it's not in France, and it's not even in Italy. Now, that sounds kind of sacrilegious to say my favorite vineyard region is not in Italy. It's not. It's actually in Switzerland, and it's along Lake Geneva, and they have a World Heritage Site because these vineyards have been here for centuries, very old vineyards, and they're all on, they're like on terraces, so they're kind of terraced up the mountains side there, and it is remarkable walking through those vineyards, visited in those little small towns along Lake Geneva. And it's crazy, crazy incredible. I loved it. And then you have on the other side of that mountain, you get into the Swiss Alps that are amazing. And I just love the culture. I love the people. Everything about Switzerland I loved. And so it would easily make my top 5 list. And I think Switzerland, like Italy, is a little cliche. Even Ireland, you may even say, is a little cliche. Ecuador and Norway, those kind of in Scotland, are kind of on the outer fringes and as favorites. But everybody would go, okay, we know you like Ireland. We get that because of your family and so forth. And then people would say Italy because it's very well known and everybody wants to go to Italy, but it's worth going to Italy. Okay, I'm getting a little excited here because it is. It is really worth it, even though there's a few downsides, like I mentioned. Switzerland is another one of those things that sounds kind of cliche-ish. That's not even a word, is it? But it does sound cliche. But Switzerland, to me, was just a gem, a very big gem. And I'm going to tell you why. There is one drawback to Switzerland. But before we do that, I'm going to say that country is like really high tech. It is very, very high tech. Even though most of the rural areas and a lot of your accommodations kind of see like lodging and all that, they have some really cool technology in Switzerland. And you can kind of see it. You can kind of see it in their cities and in their businesses and stuff like that. So that's pretty remarkable. But I'm going to move on to, I've told you what I liked about Switzerland. The landscape and terrain, top notch. The people and the culture, love it. The food, cuisine, and all that, it's good. It's solid. And the cheeses are unbelievable. The accessibility of places, the road systems, everything about that is great, and everything's easy to, whether you're on a ferry or you're taking a train or whatever you're doing, is very easy, and so you don't have that tensed feel. And the tourists are not that bad, unless you go to, you go to Lodenbrotten or Murin or something like that. It's going to be touristy up there. But the other places in the country are not overran by tourists. Actually, I was shocked at Lake Geneva because there's so many little towns and villages to visit, and the vineyards really laid back, not a lot of tourists at all. Now, when you go to, Montreux, there is, if you go down to the local, the lakefront, beautiful. It's nice. A lot of vendors down there. It's cool. Now, you're going to see a lot more tourists there, but I also noticed that probably half the people there were locals. So that was kind of fun. And Switzerland has, also has their fair shares of unique castles. And the history of Switzerland is really cool if you ever want to get into it, because it's not near as studied, especially in the West or like in the States, like British history or Irish history or French history and so forth. Swiss history they played a very big role in things over the years that I think even Europeans themselves don't realize. So Switzerland easily makes my top 5 list. If I have any drawback on Switzerland, and this is really the only drawback, and it's kind of like Norway, but it's the drawback, and that's cost. But it's even worse. I would say Switzerland is the most expensive country that I've ever been to. Iceland is right there with it, but Switzerland is very, very expensive. The the gas in Switzerland is very expensive. I mean, when you leave Switzerland and go down to Italy, you will notice within, like 100 miles into Italy that the price of gas just dropped dramatically. And I'm saying you notice it when you fill up. Even when you go to Italy, the food just becomes. I mean, we ordered a pizza in a little small village in northern Italy. So we ordered a pizza, like a large pizza with 2 drinks, and I believe it came to like I want to say like $14, way cheaper than here in the States for that kind of pizza. A specialty pizza and 2 drinks. And to put that in perspective, we ate at a mill in I can't remember the name of the city, but we ate a meal the night before, and the meal takeout. We had a glass of wine, but take out the wine and just the meal, and we had water. So the only thing we ordered for drink wise was water in our meal, and take out what we paid for the wine. The meal was like $86. It was a good meal. It was a small little pasta and some bread. $86 or $88. Okay, that's no appetizers. That is no dessert. That's not even with the wine added in. with the wine and tip and everything, was like over $100. Very, very expensive. So that's the drawback on Switzerland is that if you rent a car, the car rental actually is as affordable as the States. So that's a plus. But if you're doing a lot of travel, the price of gas is very expensive. Once again, that's usually not a deal breaker for people that like me that like to have road trips and do a lot of venture. That's expected in some places. But the cost of eating is very, very expensive if you eat out. And even if you go to shops and want to buy chocolate or like Cokes or sports drinks or anything like that, it's extremely, extremely expensive. So I think that's the drawback on Switzerland is the cost of gas, the cost of eating out and food. The accommodations were also a lot more expensive than other places around it. If you look at accommodations in Italy or Austria compared to Switzerland, there's no comparison. Italy was probably about a third of the price that we paid for in Switzerland. And to put it in context, on the other side, when you pull up bookme.com and you look at accommodations around the Geneva area, around Lake Geneva, it'll show you accommodations on both sides. If you're on the north side of Lake Geneva, you're going to be in Switzerland. If you're on the south side of Lake Geneva, you're going to be in France. And if something in France costs $100 per night, an accommodation, that same accommodation is going to be probably about $175 a night over in Switzerland. So it cost effectively, if we would have went on the French side of the French Riviera of Lake Geneva on the French side, it would have been, well under half the cost of staying on the Swiss side. But been to France before, so I wanted to stay in Switzerland. And plus, all the things that I wanted to visit along Lake Geneva, such as the vineyards and the castles and everything, with that meant we had to stay on the Swiss side. So a little bit more expensive, but it is the most expensive place that I've ever been to in the world, hands down. That leads me to the next thing, that paying a lot of money for accommodations is okay. I can live with that. Paying more for for gas, I can live with that. But the really thing that really stung the pocketbook, to say, is the attractions are really, really expensive, especially if you go to London and you want to go up to like the Bond spot. I can't remember the name of the mountain, but it's way on the top of the Swiss Alps. I mean, it's it'll cost you like over like $160 to go from the bottom and stage yourself all the way to the top. $160 just to take the cable car to the top of the mountain. We didn't do that. We went up to the next highest spot, and I think it cost like $40 per person just to ride a cable car. So it was worth it, by the way, because it was beautiful. One of my favorite spots in the world was there. And yes, that's really one of those touristy spots that does actually live up to the hype. It does, and I really highly recommend it. I wouldn't recommend going in a high touristy season because we lucked out. There was quite a bit of tourists, but it seemed like a lot of them got off on the first or second stop, and then a good chunk that were really dedicated went all the way up to the top. So we went almost to the top. It was the next one, and man, we had like the trail. We passed two people, a man and a woman with their two children, and then a couple, and that was it. And the views were incredible. Then we walked all the way back down to the next village, and it's like a small road. It was not really a trail. The walking path was a small road because you can't drive to these places, right? Vehicles are not allowed. They're off limits in these little villages. Now, the locals can drive their vehicles up, or they can bring supplies up, but they have to have really small vehicles. So walking down it was beautiful, and the path was very accessible. And, it really took no physical effort to get to the next village. And the next village was really awesome because they had this little this pub, and they had beer that they've been making for a long time there in the Swiss Alps, and it was amazing. It was amazing beer. So if I say anything about Switzerland, it would be the accommodation and attractions and the price of gas. So other than that, it's an expensive vacation to do, but it's worth it. But you can still, like I said, budget around them, because I wasn't going to pay $300 a night for a hotel when I could get one for 150. And it was very nice and nothing wrong with it at all. But for 150 on the France side, I would be staying in, very elaborate, much nicer places. So drawback on Switzerland would be that. But I do highly recommend Switzerland, and it is in my top 5. So today's podcast was about what many people have asked me over the years. What are my what are the best places to visit, or what is the most beautiful places I've ever been? And I said I don't like answering those questions because I don't like to say anything's best. It's all about preference, and it's all about what you prefer and you're biased, and what you aim for and what you enjoy. So instead, I answered those questions as what are my top 5 favorite places that I've visited around the world. And to recap, Norway, Italy, Ecuador, Ireland and Scotland combined in one because so much of the culture of it's very similar, and Switzerland. Each one of those countries have a great, diverse, and beautiful terrain and landscape. The people I found in all those countries were lovely. The culture and history is rich in all those countries, and a lot of different attractions. You'll never run out of things to do in any of these places. They're well worth the trip. And while Norway and Switzerland can be expensive, there's ways to do it and it not break the bank. And one good thing is that if you do it just right, you can fly into Norway very cheap. You could fly into Norway at times for around $550, $580 round trip. You can fly into Switzerland for, between about $550 and $700. If you play your cards right and you watch the trends, you can easily get to either one of those countries round trip between $550 and $700, which is not a bad price at all. So that kind of offsets some of the price. And then renting a car there is not all that expensive. It's no more expensive than anywhere else in Europe. So the one thing is in Norway, I was able to probably get my average accommodation in Norway, which was around $100 a night, and really stayed at some cool farmhouses and different lodges. So Switzerland, the same thing. It was a little bit more expensive. It was probably about $150, $160 a night versus about $120 in Norway. But even if you go to the States, say you would go to the Smoky Mountains, say you go to Gatlinburg, or you go down to Florida, you're easily going to be spending $150, $175 a night, if not more. And you're not even staying anything that's that extravagant and very luxurious, So that's what I would recommend. Those are my top 5: Norway, Italy, Ecuador, Switzerland, and Ireland/Scotland. Beautiful places, great history, great culture. So there you have it. The next time you want to ask, hey, Jonah, what is the best country? What is the most beautiful country? What's the most enjoyable country that you've ever visited in your travels around the world? Well, my favorites, I'll put it this way, my favorites to my biases and what I prefer and like and my experience, Norway, Italy, Ecuador, Switzerland, Ireland, and Scotland, and not in any particular order. I hope that answers your questions. We have taken about an hour and 12 minutes to get through this video. I hope you've kind of gotten some insight on how these countries are and some of the good aspects about them and the possible cons. And I hope you get out there and travel, man. The world is a big place, and don't stay in your bubble. And you got to get out of your city. You got to get out of your state. You got to get out of your region. And sometimes you just got to get out of your country and explore the world and be adventurous. Life is a venture, and I'm going to always travel. I'm going to do a podcast on my next upcoming countries I'm going to visit. Hopefully, I'm going to have that out in a few days. But this has been the top 5 my favorite countries that I visited around the world. I'm Jonah MacTavish-Slaton, and thank you for watching my podcast. And until next time, get your ass out there and do some traveling. Experience the world.